8:48 in the morning, December 27th, 1941, a frozen beach on the coast of Norway. The ramp of landing craft Assault 17 dropped onto Norwegian sand, and before any of the 43 British commandos could move, before German machine guns opened fire from shore batteries 200 yards ahead, before HMS Kenya's guns completed their final salvo, Captain James McLeod stepped forward into the freezing surf. He was holding bagpipes, Highland bagpipes inflated and ready, while bullets cracked overhead and mortar rounds exploded in the water behind the landing craft, while his men crouched behind steel gunnels waiting for orders to advance. McLeod stood fully exposed to enemy fire and began playing the March of the Cameron Men. The sound cut through battle noise like a blade through flesh, high-pitched, ancient, impossible. German soldiers in the coastal battery heard Scottish music coming from a landing craft under their guns, and their training failed them. They had learned to fight British infantry with rifles and grenades. They had not learned to fight an American officer playing music while walking calmly toward their position through machine gun fire. McLeod was 35 years old, born in Boston to Scottish immigrants who fled their homeland after losing everything. Graduated from Sandhurst in 1926 as one of the first American exchange students. Served 10 years in the British Army before quitting because peacetime garrison duty bored him to the edge of madness. Rejoined in 1939 when war broke out. He had volunteered for the commandos carrying equipment that belonged in a museum. A 6-foot English longbow with 70 pounds of draw weight, a Scottish claymore broadsword with basket hilt, and the Highland bagpipes currently announcing his arrival to every German soldier within earshot. In the next 10 minutes, those medieval weapons would prove more effective than modern firearms. But to understand why Jim McLeod was walking into machine gun fire playing music from another century, you need to understand where he came from. You need to understand what his brother taught him. You need to understand that this was not madness. This was tribute. This is his story. Boston, Massachusetts, summer of 1912. James McLeod was 6 years old when his brother Rob first put bagpipes in his hands. Small hands, too small for the instrument. But Rob was patient. They lived in a third-floor walk-up in South Boston, where Scottish immigrants clustered together speaking Gaelic and celebrating Highland traditions that America had mostly forgotten. Their father, Duncan, had fled Scotland in 1902 after English landlords took his family's farm. He became a Boston police sergeant, worked the Irish and Italian neighborhoods, came home exhausted every night wanting his sons to be Americans, real Americans, not old country dreamers carrying bagpipes and swords like they were still living in the Highlands. But Rob had other ideas. Rob was 6 years older than Jim, born in 1900, old enough to remember Scotland before the family fled. He kept the traditions alive, taught Jim to play the bagpipes starting at age 7, taught him Scottish history, Clan MacLeod warriors who fought at Culloden in 1746, the last clan battle where Highland charges broke English lines before artillery tore them apart. The bagpipes were awkward at first. Jim's fingers were too small, the chanter too long, the drones too heavy. But Rob showed him how to hold the instrument, how to control the bag pressure, how to make the reeds sing. They practiced in the tiny apartment while Duncan was working his beat, while their mother Agnes pretended not to hear. By age 10, Jim could play basic tunes. By 12, he could play well enough to perform at neighborhood gatherings. By 14, he was good enough that other Scottish families invited him to play at weddings and funerals. But Rob taught him more than music. He taught him why it mattered. They were sitting on the fire escape one summer evening. 1920, Jim was 14, Rob was 20. The sun was setting over Boston Harbor, turning everything gold and orange. Rob was smoking a cigarette. Jim was cleaning the bagpipes. Psychology, Jimmy. That is what wins battles, not just weapons. Jim looked up from the reeds he was oiling. The English had better guns at Culloden, better artillery, better organization. But Highland warriors screaming down hills with claymores made English soldiers freeze, made them forget their training. Fear is a weapon, same as steel. Rob had enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1917 when America entered World War I, served with the 77th Division in France. Came home 1919 with Distinguished Service Cross and stories about trench warfare that he only told Jim. Stories about mud and rats and men dying in ways that made no sense. But also stories about psychology, about what worked and what did not work when men were trying to kill each other. The Germans knew we were coming. They could hear us shouting, hear us running, but hearing us made them more afraid, made them nervous, made their aim worse. Sound is psychological weapon. Music even more so. Music means confidence. Music means we are not afraid of you. Music means we are coming and nothing you do will stop us. Jim absorbed every lesson, practiced the bagpipes obsessively, not just to preserve Scottish heritage like Duncan feared, but because Rob made him understand that music could be weapon, that sound could create fear, that performance could become power. Summer of 1924. Jim was 18. Rob had moved to England 2 years earlier to join the Royal Air Force, had become pilot, was stationed at RAF Duxford, flying training missions. Jim traveled to Scotland that summer to visit clan lands, spent 3 months learning more about traditions, visited Culloden battlefield where his ancestors had fought, stood on ground where Clan MacLeod had charged English lines, knowing they would probably die, but charging anyway because courage mattered more than survival. He learned archery at Edinburgh Archery Club, discovered he had natural talent for it, could put an arrow through a playing card at 50 yards by age 19. The longbow felt right in his hands, another weapon from another century that still worked if you understood how to use it properly. Rob convinced him to apply to Royal Military College Sandhurst. American exchange students were rare but accepted. Jim was smart, had good letters of recommendation, spoke enough Gaelic that British officers found him interesting. He was accepted in 1925, graduated 1926 with commission into Manchester Regiment. He served in Burma and India and various colonial postings, learned to be conventional infantry officer, led patrols, trained men, wrote reports, did everything by regulation. But secretly he practiced medieval weapons in his spare time. The longbow, the claymore, the bagpipes kept the traditions alive, kept Rob's lessons fresh in his mind, because Rob had taught him something important. That modern warfare with its machine guns and artillery and poison gas was designed to make individual soldiers irrelevant. You were just a number, just a target, just a statistic. But medieval weapons made you individual again, made you a person, made enemies see you as human being they had to confront rather than an anonymous target they could shoot from distance. That mattered. That was what Rob believed. That personal courage could still shift outcomes even when technology tried to eliminate it. September of 1936. Jim quit the British Army. He was 30 years old, had served 10 years, was a good officer by all accounts. But peacetime garrison duty was insufferably boring. Paperwork and inspections and training exercises that never led to anything real. He needed something else, something that felt alive. He worked as newspaper editor in Nairobi, Kenya for 2 years, appeared in films as an archer and bagpipe player, rode motorcycles 1,500 miles across Burma and India just to feel wind and speed and danger, became serious archery competitor, trained obsessively, competed internationally, July of 1939, World Archery Championships in Oslo, Norway. Jim finished 26th out of 63 competitors from 14 nations, not a champion, but good enough to put an arrow through a playing card at 50 yards, good enough to kill a man before that man ever heard the shot. He returned to England in August feeling restless, feeling like something was coming, feeling like the world was about to transform. September 1st, Germany invaded Poland. September 3rd, Britain declared war on Germany. Jim was in London when he heard the news. Radio announcement. Prime Minister Chamberlain's voice crackling through static. This country is at war with Germany. He thought about Rob immediately. Rob was still RAF pilot, squadron leader now, flying Spitfires with number 19 Squadron. This would be his war, the real war, not training exercises or colonial policing, but actual combat against serious enemy. Jim received telegram from Rob 3 days later. Short, direct, classic Rob. Jimmy, this is it, real war. The traditions matter now. Show them how Scots fight. Jim rejoined his old regiment September 10th, reported for duty, brought his longbow, his claymore broadsword, and his bagpipes. His commanding officers thought he was insane. The War Office had no regulations covering officers who wished to carry medieval weapons against panzer divisions. Jim did not care what they thought. He remembered Rob's lessons about psychological warfare, about fear being a weapon. about enemies freezing when confronted with the unexpected. Modern armies had forgotten those lessons, had become so focused on technology that they had eliminated the human element. Jim would bring it back, would prove that individual courage and unconventional thinking still mattered. His fellow officers were skeptical. Some openly mocked him, called him theatrical, called him attention-seeking, called him Mad Jim. He ignored them all, waited for chance to prove the methods worked. May of 1940, that chance came, but first came news that changed everything. September 15th, 1940. Jim was in France with the British Expeditionary Force when he received the telegram. Red Cross notification, next of kin, his hands shook when he opened the envelope. Squadron leader Robert McLeod killed in action September 15th during air combat over Kent. Aircraft shot down by enemy fighter. Pilot survived crash but died from burns 3 days later in hospital. Body will be returned to family for burial. Our condolences for your loss. Jim read it 3 times. Each time the words meant the same thing. Rob was dead. His brother, his teacher, his connection to Scotland and tradition, and everything that made the bagpipes and swords and longbow meaningful. Dead at age 40 defending Britain during the Battle of Britain. He requested emergency leave, traveled back to England for the funeral, military ceremony at RAF Duxford, flag-draped coffin, honor guard, rifle volleys fired over the grave. Rob had been hero, had shot down 3 German aircraft before being killed himself, had defended Britain during its darkest hour when invasion seemed certain. Jim stood beside the grave in his full-dress uniform with the claymore at his belt and bagpipes under his arm. The RAF chaplain spoke about duty and sacrifice and how Rob had given his life defending freedom. Other pilots saluted. Women cried. Duncan MacLeod stood silent and broken beside Agnes, who could not stop sobbing. Jim made a decision at that funeral. Rob had believed in the old ways, had believed that Highland traditions and psychological warfare could matter in modern combat, had died before seeing it proven, before knowing if his teachings about fear and courage and individual action had any validity in an age of machines and mass production and industrial killing. Jim would prove it for him, would carry Rob's lessons into every battle, would show that individual courage and unconventional thinking could overcome superior firepower, would honor his brother by making German soldiers freeze the way English soldiers had frozen at Culloden in 1746. That night in his quarters, Jim wrote in his journal, the only time he wrote about his feelings, the only time he admitted what he was really doing with the medieval weapons. Rob taught me that fear is the oldest weapon, that a man charging with a sword that is more terrifying than a man firing from cover, that bagpipes make soldiers think they are facing something beyond normal, something primal, something that does not follow rules. The Germans have better tanks, better aircraft, better organization, but they do not have men who will walk into machine gun fire playing music. They do not have warriors who fight like their ancestors fought. That is my advantage. That is how I honor Rob, by being what they cannot prepare for. From that moment forward, Jim MacLeod's medieval weapons were not eccentricity, they were tribute. Every time he played the bagpipes in combat, he was honoring Rob's belief that psychological warfare mattered. Every time he drew his claymore, he was proving that old ways could defeat modern enemies. He would carry those weapons until the war ended or he died, whichever came first. May 27th, 1940, 7:42 in the morning. Near the French village of L'Epinette, the British Expeditionary Force was collapsing around them. Dunkirk evacuation was starting. Officers were burning classified documents in ditches. Sergeants were burying equipment they could not carry. Private soldiers were throwing away rifles just to run faster toward the coast and the boats that might save them. But Jim MacLeod was not running. He was crouched behind a crumbling stone wall with his English longbow, watching 5 German soldiers advance through morning mist. Wehrmacht infantry patrol moving toward British positions. Standard reconnaissance. 30 yards away. Then 25. Then 20. His lieutenant, a conventional officer named Pemberton, was beside him with a rifle. "Sir, you cannot seriously be planning to use that bow. Just shoot them with your service revolver." Jim did not respond. He was remembering Rob's lessons about surprise, about enemies not expecting the impossible, about a second of frozen confusion being enough to change the outcome of an engagement. The German sergeant leading the patrol was scanning hedges, checking windows, looking for standard threats, rifles, machine guns, grenades. His training was good, his movements were professional, but he never thought to look for a medieval weapon. Jim drew the bowstring back to his ear. The U-wood creaked under 70 pounds of tension. His fingers found the familiar anchor position on his cheek, the same position he had used 10,000 times in competition. 10,000 times shooting at targets that did not bleed or down or have families waiting for them in Munich. He had never shot at a human being before, had killed deer in Scottish Highlands, had competed against targets made of straw and painted circles. But never this. Never releasing an arrow, knowing it would end a life. Knowing some woman in Germany would receive telegram just like the one about Rob. The arrow flew. The German sergeant dropped without a sound, the shaft buried deep in his chest between ribs. He looked down, confused, trying to understand what had happened. His hands fumbled at the wooden shaft protruding from his uniform. Then his legs gave out. He sat down hard in the mud. Died within 90 seconds as blood pressure dropped and brains stopped receiving oxygen. The other 4 Germans scattered immediately, not understanding what weapon had killed their sergeant. No gunshot, no explosion, no muzzle flash, just their sergeant collapsing. They ran toward tree lines shouting in panic, shouting warnings about snipers and ambush and unknown threats. Jim drew another arrow but did not shoot. Let them run. Let them tell others. Let the story spread. 5 Germans had encountered a British officer. 4 ran away in confusion and fear. That was psychological warfare. That was what Rob had taught him. Lieutenant Pemberton stared at him with mixture of horror and fascination. My God, that was the first longbow kill in combat since the 17th century. Good. Let the Germans wonder what else they are facing out here. That night, Jim cleaned the longbow and thought about the German sergeant. Young man, maybe 25 years old. British soldiers had found a photo in his pocket later. Wife and 2 children in Munich. Man fighting for his country, same as Jim was fighting for his. But the sergeant had died quickly. Confused but not suffering. The arrow had severed major blood vessels. Blood pressure dropped rapidly. Consciousness ended within seconds. Clean. Professional. The way warriors had killed for thousands of years before gunpowder changed everything. Jim decided that if he had to kill, this was better than machine guns tearing men apart. Better than artillery turning soldiers into unidentifiable pieces of meat. Better than drowning in mud or burning in tanks. The longbow was mercy compared to modern warfare's industrial brutality. The British Expeditionary Force evacuated 338,000 soldiers from Dunkirk beaches between May 26th and June 4th. Most left behind weapons and vehicles and equipment in pride. They came home, defeated, exhausted, expecting German invasion within weeks. Jim McLeod came home with his bow and his sword and his bagpipes intact. He had covered the retreat of his company, had killed 3 more German soldiers with arrows. Each time from distances where silence mattered more than firepower. Each time creating confusion and fear in Wehrmacht patrols who could not understand how their men were dying without gunshots. His commanding officers did not know what to make of him. Some thought he was showing off. Others thought he was genuinely insane. But the results spoke for themselves. McLeod's company had suffered fewer casualties during the retreat than any other in the regiment. Men wanted to serve with him because his unconventional methods somehow worked even when they should not have worked. 3 weeks after Dunkirk, Jim received orders to report to the War Office in London. He expected reprimand for unorthodox tactics. Instead, he met Colonel Dudley Clark, who was forming new special operations units. Captain McLeod, I have read your after-action reports from France. Unconventional weapons, psychological tactics, 3 confirmed kills with only a longbow. Your commanding officers think you are mad. I think you are exactly what we need. Clark explained the situation. Britain was forming commando units, small teams of highly trained soldiers who would raid the coastlines of occupied Europe, destroy facilities, kill Germans, gather intelligence, disappear before reinforcements arrived. The missions would be suicidal. The training would be brutal beyond anything the British Army had ever attempted. Volunteers only. Jim volunteered immediately. This was what Rob had prepared him for, not conventional warfare with its rigid hierarchies and inflexible tactics, but specialized operations where individual skill and psychological impact mattered more than numbers, or equipment, or doctrine. Achnacarry Castle in Scotland, July through November of 1940. Commando training in the Scottish Highlands was designed to break men. 30-mile marches carrying full equipment, amphibious landings in freezing water, learning to kill silently with knives and garrots in bare hands, firing live ammunition over each other's heads during exercises to simulate real combat conditions. Men who could not keep up were sent back to their units in disgrace. Casualty rate during training was high. Injuries were common. Some men quit, some failed. Some died in training accidents that the instructors considered acceptable losses. Jim excelled at everything. He was 34 years old, older than most volunteers, but stronger and more determined than men 10 years younger. He could march longer, shoot straighter, fight harder, and he brought skills that no other commando possessed. That is where he met Samuel Hayes. Sam Hayes was 22 years old, Boston Irish-American like Jim, but from Charlestown rather than South Boston. His father had been a longshoreman who died in an accident when Sam was 16. Sam had worked his way through 2 years of Boston College before the war, studying engineering, dreaming of building bridges that would last centuries. But when Britain declared war on Germany, Sam felt pulled to fight. His grandfather had emigrated from County Cork in Ireland. Sam had grown up hearing stories about British oppression of Irish people, about famines and injustice and colonial brutality. But he also understood that Hitler was worse than anything Britain had ever done. The enemy of my historical enemy was someone worth helping. Sam enlisted in U.S. Army in 1939, transferred to British Army as volunteer in 1940, specifically requested commando training because he wanted to be where the real fighting would happen. He was younger than most volunteers but smarter, had engineering knowledge that let him read terrain and calculate angles and improvise solutions. Most importantly, he was fearless in the way young men are fearless before they have been shot at enough times to develop healthy fear. Jim and Sam met during amphibious training. Sam was struggling with a landing craft that had fouled its propeller on submerged debris. Jim helped him fix it using techniques he had learned during his years in India and Burma. They discovered they were both from Boston, both volunteers fighting for Britain while America stayed neutral, both understanding that conventional warfare would waste their skills where specialized operations would maximize them. "Why did you join the Brits?" Sam asked while they worked on the fouled propeller. "America is not even in the war yet. My brother died fighting for them." Seemed right to finish what he started. "Your grandfather always said the English were bastards, but Nazis are worse. Sometimes you fight with bastards against devils." They became close friends immediately. Both outsiders in a British unit, both Americans who believed the fight mattered even if their country disagreed, both understanding that this war would define their generation one way or another. One night during training, Sam watched Jim practice with the longbow, watched him put arrows into targets at 100 yards in near darkness, watched him draw and release with mechanical precision that came from thousands of hours of practice. "You planning to actually use that against Germans?" "Combat, yes, Jim. The Germans have machine guns, mortars, panzers. You are bringing medieval weapons to modern war. My brother taught me something in World War I. Fear is a weapon. A German knows how to respond to rifles. He has been trained for that scenario. But a German does not know how to respond to a man charging with a sword. His mind freezes trying to process what he is seeing. And in combat, a frozen second means death. That is insane. That is exactly the point. If I am acting insane, the enemy cannot predict what I will do. Unpredictability is advantage." Sam was not convinced. He thought Jim was brilliant but suicidal, thought the medieval weapons would get both of them killed, thought psychological warfare was interesting theory that would not survive contact with reality. He would be proven wrong at Vauxhall. November of 1941. Combined Operations Headquarters in London. The briefing room was cold despite radiators clanking in corners. Maps of Norway's coastline covered every wall. Intelligence photos showed German installations at Moløy and South Vauxhall, coastal batteries with large caliber guns, garrison buildings housing Wehrmacht troops, fish oil factories the Germans were using to produce glycerin for explosives. Colonel John Durnford Slater commanded the operation. 570 men from multiple commando units. Royal Navy cruisers would provide naval gunfire support. RAF bombers would give air cover and drop smoke to blind German gunners. The assault would happen December 27th at dawn. The target was strategically important. Moly Island controlled access to a network of fjords that German ships used to transport iron ore from Sweden. Approximately 150 German soldiers garrisoned there, with 4 coastal artillery guns and an anti-aircraft battery. The mission was to destroy installations, capture intelligence documents, and kill as many Germans as possible before withdrawing. Jim's role was clear: lead number 3 Commando's assault on Moly Island. First wave: take the shore battery before it could sink the landing craft, bringing follow-on forces. Sam Hayes would be his second in command. 2 weeks before the raid, Sam confronted Jim privately in their quarters. "I need to know you are not planning to get us all killed with your medieval weapons. I am planning to terrify Germans so thoroughly that they surrender rather than fight. And if they do not surrender, if they just shoot you while you are playing bagpipes." Jim was silent for a long moment, then spoke words he had never said to anyone except in his journal after Rob died. "My brother Rob taught me that the man who acts fearless has advantage over the man who feels fear. Even if the fearless man is terrified inside, even if it is performance, the enemy only sees the performance. And performance can break enemy morale faster than bullets. You are performing this whole time. Of course I am performing. You think I am not scared. I am scared every time I pick up these weapons. But Rob taught me that admitting fear means losing before you even fight. So I perform confidence. I perform fearlessness. And eventually the performance becomes reality because I have done it so many times that it becomes habit." This was the first time Jim admitted vulnerability to anyone since Rob died 14 months earlier. Sam understood then that Jim's medieval weapons were not arrogance or theatricality. They were armor. Psychological armor against a war that wanted to break every man who fought in it. Christmas Day, December the 25th, 1941. The commandos loaded onto transport ships HMS Prince Charles and HMS Prince Leopold. They sailed north through Arctic darkness, past the coast of Scotland into the Norwegian Sea. Temperature dropped below freezing. Ice formed on deck railings. The sea was rough. Men huddled in their quarters, checking weapons and writing letters home and trying not to think about what was coming. Jim spent the voyage checking equipment methodically. Claymore edge sharp enough to shave with. Bagpipes tuned and the reeds properly moistened. Longbow and arrows waterproofed against sea spray. His service revolver loaded as backup. Thompson's submachine gun as final option if everything went catastrophically wrong. Sam watched him prepare with mixture of admiration and dread. "When we land, you are really going to play the bagpipes first thing before we even secure the beach. First thing, before the Germans understand what is happening, before they have time to organize response. I am going to walk off that landing craft playing March of the Cameron Men, and every German on that island is going to think they are facing a madman. And madmen are terrifying because they do not follow rules. What if they shoot you immediately? Then I die, but I die doing what Rob believed in, proving that psychological warfare matters, that individual courage can shift outcomes, that modern weapons have not made ancient methods obsolete." December 26, 2300 hours. The ships reached launch position 12 miles off the Norwegian coast. Landing craft were lowered into black water. Commandos climbed down cargo nets in full combat gear. Temperature was -15 Celsius. Wind was howling. The sea was rough enough to make half the men seasick. Jim took his position in the bow of landing craft Assault 17. Sam Hayes was beside him along with 41 other commandos from No. 3 Commando, men who had trained together for months, men who trusted their officers even when those officers carried medieval weapons. Jim held his bagpipes carefully, felt the weight of the claymore at his belt, thought about Rob teaching him clan battle cries in their apartment in Boston, thought about the German sergeant in France who died confused, thought about whether psychological warfare could really work against professional soldiers in prepared defensive positions with overlapping fields of fire. In 8 hours, he would find out. In 8 hours, he would either prove Rob right or die trying. In 8 hours, 150 German soldiers would encounter something they had never trained for and could not predict. In 8 hours, the bagpipes would start playing. The landing craft surged through smoke toward the beach. 8:48 in the morning. December 27, 1941. RAF Hampton bombers had dropped smoke canisters along the shoreline to blind German gunners. HMS Kenya was firing 6-inch guns at the shore battery. Each salvo sounded like thunder. Explosions lit the Norwegian coast like lightning strikes. Jim McLeod stood in the bow of the craft, fully exposed to enemy fire. Every other commando crouched behind steel gunnels, seeking protection from bullets. But their commander remained standing, bagpipes inflated, ready. The shore was 200 yards away, then 150, then 100. German machine gun fire began tracking the landing craft. Bullets cracked overhead. One round hit the steel ramp 2 feet from where Jim stood. He did not move, did not flinch, just stood there waiting for the moment. Sam Hayes was crouched beside him. "Sir, get down. We are in machine gun range." "Not yet. They need to see me coming." 50 yards from the beach, the German machine gunner in the shore battery was firing controlled bursts, professional, disciplined, trying to hit the landing craft's engine or steering, trying to disable it before it reached the beach. At exactly 8:48, the ramp dropped, before the Royal Navy guns completed their salvo, before anyone could give orders, before the machine gun could adjust its aim. Jim McLeod stepped into freezing surf up to his knees and began playing the March of the Cameron Men. The sound was impossible. High-pitched drones underlaid by melody, ancient Scottish tune played on a Norwegian beach under German guns. The bagpipes cut through battle noise like nothing else could, like an announcement, like a challenge, like something from a dream or a nightmare depending on which side you were on. German soldiers in the shore battery heard it and froze. Their training had covered British infantry tactics in detail, how they advanced, how they used cover, how they suppressed defensive positions with coordinated fire. Nothing in their training covered an officer playing music while walking through machine gun fire toward their guns. The machine gunner stopped firing, just for 3 seconds. His mind could not process what he was seeing, could not reconcile the input from his eyes and ears with what he knew about warfare. An officer standing fully exposed, playing an instrument, walking calmly through surf, not taking cover, not running, not doing anything that made tactical sense. 3 seconds was enough. Jim finished the tune, set the bagpipes down carefully on the sand, pulled a grenade from his belt, threw it at the nearest German position 40 yards up the beach, drew his claymore broadsword, and charged up the beach screaming a Highland battle cry that his ancestors had used at Culloden in 1746. The sound was primal, not words, just rage and defiance, and absolute commitment channeled into pure sound. The 42 commandos behind him surged forward. Sam Hayes was shouting orders. Thompson's firing, Enfield rifles cracking, grenades exploding. But the Germans were already disorganized, already confused, already making mistakes. They had watched Jim walk through machine gun fire playing bagpipes. That should have been impossible. Men did not do that. Sane men did not do that, which meant either the British had found a way to make soldiers fearless through drugs or training or something beyond German understanding, or they were facing madmen who could not be deterred by bullets. Either option was terrifying. The German defenders broke within 2 minutes. Some retreated to secondary positions. Some tried to surrender. Some just stood frozen, trying to understand what was happening. The psychology of the situation had collapsed before the commandos even reached the German positions. Jim reached the first bunker breathing hard. A German soldier appeared in the entrance with rifle raised. Jim's claymore took him across the chest. Not a killing blow, but disabling. Deep cut through muscle and bone. The man screamed and collapsed. His squad mates inside the bunker immediately threw down weapons and raised hands. Surrender. We surrender. The assault on Moley Island took less than 10 minutes. Jim led his commandos through German positions systematically. 4 coastal artillery guns destroyed with explosive charges placed in breaches. Anti-aircraft battery overrun and captured intact. German commander taken prisoner along with 15 of his men. Those who tried to resist were killed. Those who surrendered were bound and sent to the beach for evacuation. But during the assault, Sam Hayes' section had pushed too far forward. A German machine gun nest that should have been neutralized was still active, still firing, as Sam and 5 commandos were pinned in behind a low stone wall 30 yards from the gun position. The Germans were firing in controlled bursts, keeping the commandos down, waiting for reinforcements. Sam had shrapnel wound in his left shoulder from a grenade. Not disabling, but bleeding through his uniform. He pressed against the wall, knowing that if he moved, the machine gun would cut him down. Then he heard the bagpipes again. Jim appeared from the smoke, walking, not running, not taking cover, just walking directly toward the German machine gun position, playing Highland Laddie. The music was clear, perfect, like he was performing at a concert rather than under fire. The machine gunner shifted fire to Jim. Bullets kicked up frozen dirt around his feet, around his legs. One round passed so close to his head that Sam saw his hair move. Jim kept walking, kept playing. The music never stopped. The German gunner's psychology broke. He was firing at a man who should have fallen 10 times already. A man who was either immortal or insane. Either option was beyond his training to handle, beyond his experience, beyond anything he could process while maintaining combat effectiveness. The gun went silent for 2 seconds while the German tried to reload with shaking hands. Jim reached the position, put down the bagpipes, drew the claymore, appeared over the edge of the sandbag wall like a ghost from another century. The 3 Germans inside surrendered immediately, hands up, weapons dropped, too terrified to fight a man who could walk through machine gun fire playing music. Sam stood up from cover, shoulder bleeding, face pale, staring at Jim. You just walked through machine gun fire, playing music. Rob was right. Fear is the oldest weapon. That gunner froze because he could not process what he was seeing. That is psychology defeating firepower. You are insane, and that insanity just saved your life. By 900 hours, Molly Island was secure. Jim received radio message from main assault force attacking South Vogsoy across the strait. They were meeting heavy resistance. German reinforcements had arrived overnight. Street fighting had broken out. Casualties were mounting. Jim commandeered a landing craft with his remaining men and crossed to help. More fighting, more Germans. But many surrendered when they saw the officer with the sword, when they heard stories from prisoners about the American who played bagpipes under fire. Fear spreads faster than orders in combat. Stories spread faster than tactical reports. The battle for South Vogsoy lasted until mid-afternoon. 17 British commandos killed, 53 wounded, but victory achieved. Fish oil factories destroyed, German garrison eliminated, over 100 prisoners captured. Intelligence documents recovered that would help decode German shipping routes. Most importantly, the raid proved commando concept worked. Small, highly trained forces could strike deep into enemy territory and win against superior numbers. Jim McLeod's reputation spread through British military like wildfire after Vogsoy. The officer who played bagpipes under fire. The American who fought with medieval weapons. The madman who made Germans surrender through sheer psychological dominance. Newspapers ran stories. American commando brings Highland warfare to Norway. Medieval weapons defeat Nazi machine guns. The bagpiper of Molu. But more importantly, word spread through the German military as well. Wehrmacht intelligence analyzed after action reports from Molu throughout January and February of 1942. Interrogated prisoners. Tried to understand how 570 British commandos had destroyed a reinforced garrison of 300 Germans. The prisoners told confused stories about an American officer playing music while walking through bullets, about a broadsword that appeared like something from medieval paintings, about British soldiers following a madman who seemed immune to fear and possibly immune to bullets. German commanders initially dismissed the reports as combat stress hallucinations. But too many prisoners told the same story. Too many independent accounts described identical details. The claymore, the bagpipes, the American accent when he gave orders, the way German soldiers froze when confronted with something their training had not prepared them for. By March of 1942, German coastal garrisons across Norway were briefed. British commandos had an American officer who used psychological warfare tactics, medieval weapons, bagpipes, sword charges. The tactics were designed to create confusion and fear. Soldiers were instructed not to freeze if they encountered him. But knowing about psychological tactics does not make them less effective. Fear does not care about briefings. When you see a man walking through machine gun fire playing music, your training fails. Your mind fails. Euphrates Jim spent spring and summer of 1942 training new commando recruits at Aknakari, teaching them what he had learned at Vogsoy. That aggression defeats hesitation. That unexpected tactics create critical seconds of advantage. That individual courage can shift outcomes even when outnumbered. He did not teach everyone to carry medieval weapons, but he taught them to think unconventionally, to identify enemy expectations and violate them, to use psychology as much as firepower. Sam Hayes recovered from his Vogsoy wound and remained Jim's closest friend. The skepticism was gone. Sam had seen psychological warfare work, had his life saved by a man playing bagpipes, believed now that unconventional thinking mattered more than conventional firepower in specialized operations. July 9, 1943, Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. 160,000 troops from Britain and America and Canada landed on the southern coast of the island. Largest amphibious assault in history to that point. The objective was to knock Italy out of the war and open a second front against Nazi Germany. Jim commanded No. 2 Commando now, promoted to lieutenant colonel. Sam Hayes was his second in command with rank of captain. Jim landed at Catania with his complete arsenal: claymore, longbow, bagpipes, plus Thompson submachine gun and service revolver as backups for situations where medieval weapons were not practical. The fighting in Sicily was brutal. Germans had reinforced the Italian garrison with elite parachute troops and panzer divisions. Every village became a fortress. Every road became an ambush site. The Allies advanced slowly, taking casualties at every step. Jim led his commandos through mountainous terrain, bypassing enemy strong points, striking at supply lines, gathering intelligence on German positions, using psychological tactics when possible, conventional firepower when necessary. By September, Sicily had fallen, but the real test was coming. Invasion of Italian mainland at Salerno, September 9, 1943. Intelligence said the beaches would be lightly defended. Intelligence was catastrophically wrong. No. 2 Commando landed into immediate heavy resistance. Germans had anticipated the invasion and reinforced with panzer divisions and artillery. The beachhead came under fire within hours. American and British troops were pinned down, unable to advance. The entire operation was in danger of collapsing. Jim's commandos were assigned to defend Vietri sul Mare, a critical road junction overlooking the western half of Salerno Bay. If Germans captured Vietri, they could pour artillery fire onto Allied beaches. The landing force would be destroyed. For 5 consecutive days, Jim and his men held Vietri against repeated counterattacks. Infantry assaults, tank probes, mortar bombardments. They called in naval gunfire on German positions, refused to give ground even when ammunition ran low and casualties mounted. Sam was wounded again. Bullet grazed across ribs. Refused evacuation. Stayed with Jim coordinating defensive fires while bleeding through field dressings. On the night of September 14th, everything changed. German forces had occupied hills above the town of Molina. An observation post on those heights was directing artillery fire onto Allied positions. Dozens of soldiers dying every hour from accurate German artillery. The post had to be eliminated. Jim studied the terrain from Vietri. A frontal assault up those hills would be suicidal. Germans had machine guns covering every approach. Mortars zeroed in on obvious routes. Any large force would be detected and destroyed before reaching the objective. Sam suggested artillery strike. Jim shook his head. They are dug in. Shells will not get them all. And we need prisoners who can tell us German strength and dispositions. So what is the plan, you and I? Just us. Infiltrate at night. Capture what 200 men cannot take by force. That is insane. When has that ever stopped us? They left British lines after midnight on September 15th. Moved through darkness using terrain for cover. Avoided German sentries by crawling through drainage ditches and along stone walls. The night was moonless, perfect for infiltration. The Germans were not expecting an attack from 2 men armed with a sword and a revolver. They reached the first German position just before dawn. Jim spotted cigarette glow in darkness. German soldiers manning a mortar position. 4 men, relaxed, not expecting trouble. Jim drew the claymore, approached silently. His boots made no sound on the dirt. His breathing was controlled. He appeared out of darkness 6 feet from the nearest German like a figure from a nightmare. The man looked up, saw an officer holding a medieval sword. His brain could not process the image fast enough to react. Surrender, Jim said it in German. Quiet but firm, the tone that expects obedience. The four Germans dropped weapons immediately, hands up, too shocked to resist, too confused to shout warning. Whatever officer carried a sword in 1943 was something they had no training to fight. Jim used his revolver lanyard as improvised rope, tied the first prisoner's hands, gestured for him to walk ahead, used him as guide to the next position, repeated the process. Each time Jim approached silently out of darkness, each time he revealed himself suddenly with the sword gleaming in pre-dawn light, each time he demanded surrender in German, each time the Germans complied. Their training failed them. Their courage failed them. Their understanding of warfare failed them. A man with a sword should not be possible in 1943, but he was standing there, real, undeniable, terrifying. Sam followed behind with Thompson ready, covering Jim, watching for threats. But every German they encountered surrendered without resistance. By dawn, Jim and Sam had captured 42 German soldiers in an entire mortar squad. They marched their prisoners back down the path to British lines. A column of defeated Germans led by two men, one carrying a sword, the other a Thompson gun. British sentries could not believe what they were seeing. Lieutenant Colonel MacLeod and Captain Hayes appeared out of the pre-dawn darkness with 42 prisoners. Jim later described the scene as an image from the Napoleonic Wars, like something that should have happened a century earlier. But it happened in 1943, because psychology transcends technology, because fear is older than firearms, because individual courage still matters even in industrial warfare. The captured Germans provided intelligence on German strength and positions. The observation post was neutralized. Allied artillery fire became more effective. The Salerno beachhead was secured by September 20th. Jim received Distinguished Service Order for the Molina action. The citation praised his courage and initiative and leadership. It carefully did not mention that he had accomplished the entire capture with a medieval sword. Some things were too unusual even for official military records. Wehrmacht intelligence interrogated the 42 prisoners from Molina, asked how two men captured them. The Germans told the same story. American officer appeared with a sword in darkness. They were too shocked to resist, too confused to fight. The sword meant he was either insane or supremely confident. Either option was terrifying enough to break their will. By October of 1943, German soldiers across Italy were telling stories about the American commando with the sword and bagpipes. They called him Der Verrückte mit dem Schwert, the madman with the sword. Some refused to believe he was real. Just propaganda. Just stories designed to frighten them. Others hoped they would never encounter him in battle, but encounters were inevitable. April of 1944, number 2. Commando transferred to Yugoslavia to support partisan fighters against German occupation forces. The situation was savage. Germans controlled cities and major roads. Communist partisans under Josip Broz Tito dominated mountains and forests. Fighting was brutal. Prisoners rarely taken by either side. Villages destroyed in reprisal attacks. Britain decided to support Tito with weapons and supplies and military advisors. The commandos would provide direct combat support for partisan operations. Jim studied the new environment carefully. Mountains were more challenging than Italian hills. Germans were more experienced, having fought partisans for 3 years. The tactical situation was more fluid. No fixed lines, no rear areas. Every position could be flanked. He adapted his methods. Bagpipes were less useful in mountain warfare where sound carried unpredictably. But psychological principles remained valid. Aggression, surprise, confidence. Sam organized weapons training for partisan fighters, helped them improve marksmanship in small unit tactics. The partisans were impressed by American professionalism and willingness to fight alongside them rather than just give orders. May of 1944. German forces held the island of Brach in the Adriatic, controlling shipping lanes along the Dalmatian coast. A garrison of several hundred soldiers occupied fortified positions overlooking beaches. Jim was ordered to capture the island. His force consisted of 43 commandos from No. 43 Commando, a troop from No. 40 Commando, approximately 1,500 Yugoslav partisans. Mixed capabilities. British were professionals, partisans were brave but poorly equipped and loosely disciplined. The landing on Brach was unopposed on the night of May 2nd. Germans had pulled back from beaches to prepare defensive positions in hills, But partisan commanders saw German fortifications and decided to wait until morning instead of attacking immediately. Jim was furious. Delay gave Germans time to reinforce, time to prepare, time to call for support. But he could not force partisans to attack. Had to wait through long night knowing surprise was lost. The assault began the following morning. Number 43 Commando launched flanking attack on German positions. Jim led elements from Number 40 Commando in direct assault. The partisans remained at landing area providing no support. Jim and his commandos were on their own. Germans were ready. Machine guns swept approaches to hilltop positions. Mortar rounds exploded among advancing commandos. This was not Volkshohe, where surprise and confusion gave advantage. This was prepared defense against determined assault by professional soldiers who knew the commandos were coming. Jim pushed forward anyway, bagpipes playing, claymore at his side, urging men up the slope. But they were taking casualties. Men falling, ammunition running low. The attack was stalling under weight of German firepower. Sam was beside him, shouting coordinates for supporting fire, trying to suppress German machine guns with limited resources. But the mathematics of the situation were against them. Not enough firepower, not enough men, two strong defenses. A German mortar team had zeroed in on Jim's position. They fired a salvo of rounds directly into the group of commandos gathered around their commander. The explosions killed or wounded every man except Jim. He survived only because he had been standing slightly apart playing bagpipes to encourage the attack. Jim found himself alone on a hillside in enemy territory. His men were dead or dying around him. Germans were advancing toward his position. Ammunition was exhausted. Escape was impossible. He did what any officer of his character would do, sat down on a rock, picked up his bagpipes, began playing Will Ye No Come Back Again, Scottish Lament, Song of Farewell, Song of Loss and Longing and Acceptance. Final act of defiance against an enemy that had finally caught up with him. The Germans approached cautiously. Hauptmann Klaus Weber led the patrol, professional Wehrmacht officer, veteran of Eastern Front, had fought Russians at Stalingrad, thought he had seen everything war could offer, but he had never seen anything like this. British officer surrounded by bodies of his men, playing music while Germans pointed rifles at him, not fighting, not running, just sitting there playing farewell song like he was at a funeral rather than his own execution. Weber stopped his men from shooting, raised his hand, held fire. Herr Hauptmann, should we not shoot him? No, lower your weapons. But he is the enemy. He is also the bravest man I have ever seen, and brave men deserve respect even when they are enemies. Weber approached Jim slowly, hands visible, non-threatening, Englisher, American. Jim kept playing for a few more notes, then stopped, set down bagpipes, looked up at Weber. Captain James McLeod, U.S. Army serving with British commandos. You are the one they called der Verrückte mit dem Schwert, the madman with the sword. Some people call me that. I have heard stories. Molloy, Molina, Salerno, the officer who fights with medieval weapons. We did not believe stories were real. They are real. Weber gestured at the dead commandos around them. These were your men. Yes, you stayed with them. You could have escaped, but you stayed. Of course I stayed. You do not abandon men who followed you into battle. Weber understood. He had lost men at Stalingrad, knew what it meant to watch soldiers die under your command, knew the weight of leadership in combat, knew that some things transcend nationality. We must take you prisoner. You understand, I understand. A German grenade team approached from the right. Weber did not see them. They threw a grenade toward Jim's position, thinking he was still fighting. The explosion knocked Jim unconscious before Weber could stop them. Jim woke in German field hospital, head ringing from concussion, vision blurred, hands bound. He had been captured playing bagpipes while surrounded by his dead men. It was possibly the most fitting end to his combat career, if it was the end. Hauptmann Weber visited him in the hospital later that day. You will be transported to Germany for interrogation. They think you are related to British Prime Minister Churchill. I have explained you are American, not British, and not related, but they do not believe me. You will be sent to Berlin. What happened to my men? The wounded have been treated. They will be sent to prisoner camps. The dead have been buried with military honors. Your sword and bagpipes are being held as war trophies. I am sorry. I tried to preserve them for you, but my superiors refused. Jim was surprised by Weber's courtesy. Enemy showing respect to enemy. Professional soldier acknowledging another professional. Why did you not shoot me when you had the chance? Weber considered the question carefully. Because wars end, but respect for courage is eternal. You fought with honor. You stayed with your men. You faced death without fear. That deserves acknowledgement, even from an enemy. Jim was transported to Berlin under heavy guard. Germans were convinced anyone named McLeod must be connected to important figures. They interrogated him for 3 days, asked about Allied invasion plans, about special operations tactics, about connections to high command. He told them nothing except name, rank, and serial number. Stuck to Geneva Convention rights, the interrogators eventually gave up. You are not useful for intelligence. You will be sent to special prisoner facility for prominent captives. They sent him to Sachsenhausen concentration camp north of Berlin. Not the main camp with its horrors. A special compound called Sonderlager A, reserved for prominent prisoners and political enemies and suspected relatives of important figures. Jim was placed among men who had plotted against Hitler, men who had defied Nazi regime, men who expected execution at any moment. For most prisoners, Sachsenhausen was the end. For James McLeod, it was merely an intermission before the final act. Within 4 months, he would escape. Within 8 months, he would be free and walking back toward Allied lines through enemy territory. The war had tried to break him through combat. Now it would try to break him through captivity. It would fail at both. Sachsenhausen concentration camp was designed for despair. Political prisoners, resistance fighters, enemies of the state. Most inmates spent their days in forced labor, slowly starving under brutal conditions. Many never left alive. But Jim McLeod was in Sonderlager A, special compound for prominent prisoners who might have valued it as hostages or bargaining chips. His fellow inmates included diplomats and politicians and military officers and suspected relatives of Allied leaders. Among them were 3 Royal Air Force officers who had participated in the Great Escape from Stalag Luft 3 in March of 1944. 50 of their comrades had been executed by Gestapo after that escape. These 3 survived only because Luftwaffe had protected them from SS murder squads. Jim immediately began planning his own escape. He studied camp layout, guard rotations, fence lines, watchtower positions, identified weaknesses, recruited allies. One of the RAF officers was squadron leader David Forrest, 31 years old, shot down over Hamburg in 1943, had engineering background, understood structures and stress points, had helped dig the Great Escape Tunnel before being transferred. Jim and Forrest became allies. Both were escape planners by nature. Both refused to accept captivity as permanent condition. The trick is not getting out of the camp. That is the easy part. The trick is getting 200 kilometers to the Baltic coast through Nazi Germany without being caught. So we need plan for both. Escape and evasion. They started recruiting, found 2 more officers willing to risk execution for freedom, began digging tunnel from drainage ditch in the prisoner garden area, worked at night when guards were less alert, concealed excavated dirt under compost piles, used spoons and pieces of metal in their bare hands to claw through earth. The tunnel extended 110 meters, passed under fence, emerged in wooded area beyond camp perimeter. 3 months of digging, 3 months of risk, 3 months knowing that if caught, they would be shot. During those months, Jim had time to think about what happened at Brach, about the men who died under his command, about whether his medieval weapons had endangered them or protected them. He remembered Sam Hayes' original skepticism back at Achnacarry. Your bagpipes will get us killed. But Sam's life had been saved at Vogsoy by those exact tactics. Other commandos had survived because Jim's psychological warfare created confusion and hesitation in enemies. At Brach, the tactics had not failed. The situation had failed. Unsupported assault against prepared defenses, partisans refusing to attack, numerical superiority on German side. No amount of bagpipes or swords could overcome those tactical realities. But even in failure, even in capture, Hauptmann Weber's respect proved the point. Psychological warfare worked. Courage mattered. Unconventional thinking created advantages even when victory was not possible. Rob had been right all along, and Jim would carry that knowledge forward when he escaped. September 23, 1944. They crawled through the tunnel after dark. Jim and Forrest and three others emerged into woods beyond Sachsenhausen, scattered into German countryside. Jim paired with Forrest. Their plan was to walk north 200 kilometers to Baltic coast, find a boat to neutral Sweden. Simple plan, almost impossible execution. For 2 weeks they moved through Nazi Germany on foot, traveled at night, hid during day in barns and ditches and forests, stole vegetables from fields, drank from streams, avoided roads and towns and anywhere Germans might spot two ragged men who did not speak the language properly. Weather was turning cold. Autumn arriving, their clothes were inadequate prison uniforms. They had no maps, no compass, no supplies beyond what they could steal. But they were free, and freedom was worth any hardship. They made it to within a few kilometers of the Baltic coast before their luck ran out. German patrols spotted them near the town of Rostock, demanded identification. Jim and Forrest had none, were arrested, interrogated, identified as escaped prisoners from Sachsenhausen. The Germans returned them to captivity, but not to Sachsenhausen. Too much risk of another escape attempt. Jim was transferred to a camp in Austrian Alps, deep in mountains, far from any Allied lines, far from any hope of easy escape. The war was clearly turning against Germany by late 1944. Soviets were advancing from the east. Allies were pushing through France toward the Rhine. But for a prisoner in Austrian mountain camp, liberation seemed impossibly distant. Jim spent winter of 1944 to 45 as prisoner. Watched as Germany collapsed around him. Allied bombers flew overhead daily. News filtered in about Soviet advances, about fall of Berlin, about Hitler's increasingly desperate orders. The guards became nervous, uncertain, aware they might soon face justice for their crimes. In late April of 1945, Jim and approximately 140 other prominent prisoners were transferred from Austria to Tyrol region of Italy. SS planned to use them as hostages in negotiations with advancing allies. The prisoners were marched through mountains under heavy guard, not knowing if they would be released or executed. The end came unexpectedly. A delegation of prisoners had approached senior Wehrmacht officers and expressed their fear of being murdered by SS. The officers listened. A German army unit commanded by Captain Wischard von Alvensleben moved in to protect the prisoners. Wehrmacht soldiers outnumbered SS guards. After tense standoff, SS withdrew. The prisoners were abandoned in small Italian village, free but stranded in enemy territory. Most of the liberated prisoners waited for Allied forces to arrive, sat in the village, rested, celebrated tentatively. James McLeod did not wait. He had been prisoner for nearly a year, had escaped once, been recaptured, survived. He was not going to sit in a village while there was still, technically, a war happening somewhere. He began walking south toward Allied lines, 150 kilometers on foot through Italian Alps, crossing mountain passes, avoiding German stragglers who were retreating in disorder. His ankle was injured from the march. He had no food, no weapons, no identification. He walked anyway. After 8 days, he reached the town of Verona, encountered an American armored reconnaissance unit from 5th Army. The Americans did not know what to make of the ragged man appearing out of mountains claiming to be British Commando Lieutenant Colonel. Jim had no documents, no uniform insignia, nothing to prove identity. He convinced them by sheer force of personality, by authority in his voice, by stories he told about swords and bagpipes and German prisoners captured at knife point, by knowledge of military operations that only real officer would possess. The Americans sent him back through military channels. Jim arrived in Britain in May of 1945, just as Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. But the war was not over. Japan was still fighting. Thousands of soldiers dying in Burma and Malaya and islands of Southeast Asia. Jim immediately requested transfer to Pacific. He wanted to fight the Japanese, wanted to carry his sword into one more battle, play his bagpipes on one more beach, prove that ancient methods had meaning in modern age one final time. War Office approved his request. By summer of 1945, Jim was on a ship heading toward Burma, toward Japan, toward what he hoped would be the final chapter of his war. He was somewhere over India when the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. August 6, 1945. 80,000 killed instantly. 3 days later, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. August 15th, Japan announced surrender. World War II was over. Jim received the news with bitter disappointment. He had spent months preparing for invasion of Japan, had studied Japanese tactics and fortifications and fighting spirit, had planned to lead commandos onto Japanese beaches with sword and bagpipes just as he had done in Norway. Now there would be no invasion, no final battle, no chance to test himself against one more enemy. His reported reaction became part of his legend. Without those American atomic bombs, we could have kept the war going another 10 years. It was dark joke, but it revealed truth about Jim's character. He was man who thrived in combat, found meaning in chaos of war, felt most alive when death was closest. Peace was foreign country to him. September of 1945. Jim returned to Boston as war hero. Local newspapers ran stories about the Bagpiper Commando, the American who fought for Britain with medieval weapons, the officer who captured 42 Germans with a sword. Mayor gave him key to the city. Veterans organizations invited him to speak. Young men asked for autographs. Everyone wanted to hear war stories, but Jim discovered he could not settle, could not adjust to civilian life, could not sleep without nightmares visiting him 3 or 4 times per week. He saw the commandos at Brach dying around him, saw machine gun fire tracking towards Sam Hayes at Vaugsoy, saw German sergeant in France collapsing with arrow in chest, saw Rob's Spitfire burning over Kent. His wife Kate had married him quickly in October of 1941, right before Vaugsoy. They barely knew each other. She did not know how to help with the nightmares, would hold him when he woke screaming, would not ask details, just provided presence. But the nightmares continued. Jim started drinking to quiet them, not heavily enough to be alcoholic, but enough to sleep without seeing faces, without hearing screams, without feeling weight of men who died under his command. He tried various civilian jobs: security consultant, motivational speaker for corporations, outdoor adventure guide. Nothing fit, nothing matched intensity of combat. Nothing made him feel fun the way warfare had. He qualified as parachutist in his 40s, jumping from aircraft just to feel rush of adrenaline again, enrolled in advanced mountaineering courses, took up extreme skiing, anything to recreate sense of danger that had defined him during war. Kate watched him spiral, understood her husband was man shaped by war who could not function without it. "What are you looking for, Jim?" "I do not know. Something that matters." War mattered. Every decision meant life or death. Now nothing I do matters. Just comfort and routine and slowly dying of boredom. Maybe mattering is not always about life and death. Maybe mattering is about being present for people who love you. Jim tried, really tried, but peace felt like slow suffocation. Sam Hayes had stayed in British Army after war, rose to rank of major, served in various postings through late 1940s. He and Jim maintained correspondence, letters discussing their commando days, remembering fallen comrades, processing what they had been through together. 1949. Sam visited Jim in Boston. They spent a week together, hiking, drinking, telling stories that no one else would understand. It helped having someone who had been there, who knew the weight they both carried. "Do you think about Brach every day?" "Me too. The men we lost. I wonder if different tactics would have saved them." No, the tactics were not wrong. The situation was wrong. Unsupported assault against prepared defenses. No amount of bagpipes fixes that. Then why do I feel like we failed them? Because leaders always feel that way. Because we survived and they did not. Because there is no logic to who lives and who dies in combat. Just chance and timing and random luck. The conversation helped both men. Acknowledgement that survival guilt was normal. That questioning yourself meant you cared. That carrying weight of fallen comrades was price of leadership. 1952, Jim found purpose again through unexpected source. Writing, he started documenting his wartime experiences, not for publication, just for processing. Writing about Rob, about Sam, about German sergeant in France, about 42 prisoners at Melina, about Hauptmann Weber's respect at Brach. The writing was therapeutic, helped him understand his own actions, helped him see that he had been performing fearlessness as defense against actual fear, that medieval weapons had been shield as much as sword. 1955. Jim published memoir titled Fighting with Honor, An American Commandos War. It sold moderately, was reviewed well by military historians, gave him sense of purpose documenting what he had learned. The book included Rob's lessons about psychological warfare. Sam Hayes contributed forward. Several former commandos wrote endorsements. And then something unexpected happened. July 21, 1955. Jim was 49 years old when he discovered river surfing. He had moved back to Britain in 1953 for consulting work with British Special Forces, was teaching psychological warfare tactics at commando training centers. But he needed physical outlet, something dangerous, something novel, something that required focus and pushed boundaries in ways that reminded him of being alive. He had heard about tidal bore on River Severn, wave that traveled upstream twice daily from Bristol Channel. Local fishermen talked about it. No one had tried to surf it. Jim decided to be first, built homemade surfboard, studied tidal schedules, calculated best positions based on engineering principles Sam had taught him decades earlier. July 21st, he paddled out into brown water and waited. The bore appeared as white line on horizon, moving upstream against current, 5 feet at peak, not large by ocean standards, but it was wave, and Jim was determined to ride it. He caught it, surfed over a mile upstream, became one of the first people in Britain to ride a river wave. It was exactly kind of absurd, unnecessary, slightly dangerous activity that had defined his entire life. He was not content to watch wave pass, had to be on it, had to master it the way he had mastered longbow and claymore and bagpipes. Jim retired from military consulting in 1959 at age 53. His retirement was as eccentric as his military career had been. He built elaborate radio-controlled model warships and sailed them on ponds near his home, refurbished old steamboats and piloted them on Thames between Richmond and Oxford, continued playing bagpipes at memorial ceremonies and regimental gatherings. A living connection to commando traditions he had helped create. His daily commute became legendary among fellow train passengers. Jim would ride train home from London each evening. As train passed his neighborhood, he would open window and throw his briefcase out onto tracks. Startled passengers assumed he had lost his mind, but Jim had calculated exact spot where his garden-bordered railway line. Briefcase landed in his backyard every time. Saved him trouble of carrying it from station. When people asked about eccentricity, Jim smiled. If you have walked through machine gun fire playing bagpipes, throwing a briefcase from a train seems perfectly reasonable. October of 1973. Jim was 67 years old, semi-retired, spending time with grandchildren, teaching them to sail model boats, playing bagpipes at their school events, living quiet life. Then he received letter from Germany. Return address Munich, sender Klaus Weber. The name triggered immediate memory. Hauptmann Weber, the Wehrmacht officer who had captured him at Brach, who had shown respect, who had ordered his men not to shoot while Jim played bagpipes surrounded by dead commandos. Jim opened the letter with shaking hands. Dear Captain McLeod, I hope this letter finds you well. I have spent 29 years wondering if you survived the war. I have often thought about our encounter on Brach Island, about the courage you displayed, about the respect you earned even from your enemies. I am writing to inform you that several soldiers who were present at Melina in 1943 have contacted me. They wish to meet you, to thank you for showing mercy when you captured them. We are organizing a reunion in London next month, November 15th. If you are willing to attend, it would honor us greatly. With continued respect, Klaus Weber. Jim sat with letter for a long time, thinking about 42 German soldiers at Melina, about Hauptmann Weber's respect at Brach, about whether meeting former enemies was a good idea or opening old wounds that had finally begun to heal. He decided to go. November 15th, 1973. 15 German veterans attended the reunion in London, ages 55 to 70, now old men, businessmen and teachers and tradesmen, men who had been young soldiers in 1943. Klaus Weber was there, 68 years old, walked with cane from Eastern Front wounds, but eyes were sharp, recognized Jim immediately. They shook hands. Former enemies, Now, old men remembering shared history. Captain McLeod, you look well. You too, Hauptmann Weber. Just Klaus now. The war has been over a long time. The reunion was deeply emotional. German veterans stood one by one, introduced themselves, told their stories. Franz Neumann, 65, had been 22 at Melina. I was in first group you captured. You appeared with sword in darkness. I thought I was hallucinating. When I realized you were real, I was more terrified than I had ever been. You could have killed me. You chose to scare me instead. That mercy saved my life. Hermann Schmidt, 59, had been 19 at Melina. My son is named James, after you, because you gave me chance to have son. You could have cut my throat. Instead, you tied my hands and marched me to British lines. I went to prisoner camp in England, came home 1946, met my wife 1947, had 3 children, all because you showed mercy with that sword. Otto Klein, 62, had been 20 at Melina. I tell my grandchildren about you. The American officer with medieval weapons. They think I am making it up. I show them documents, show them photos, tell them that sometimes in war, courage and mercy exist together. That the most dangerous man can also be most honorable. Each story hit Jim harder than the last. He had not thought about consequences of his actions beyond immediate tactical results. Had not considered that those 42 prisoners went home, had families, raised children, lived full lives because he had captured them rather than killed them. Klaus Weber spoke last, Captain McLeod. I have thought about Brach many times, about finding you surrounded by dead men playing farewell song, about ordering my soldiers not to shoot. Some of my comrades thought I was soft, thought I should have executed you immediately. But I believed then and believe now that honor exists even in war, that respect for courage transcends nationality, that the way we fight matters as much as whether we win. You proved that at Melina. You could have killed those men. Instead, you showed them mercy disguised as terror. You let them surrender. You treated them as human beings even when they were enemies. That is not how most of us fought. Most of us killed first and asked questions later. But you chose differently. And those men went home. And now we are all here together, no longer enemies. Just old soldiers remembering what it meant to be young and terrified and somehow survive. Jim was fighting tears. This was closure he had not known he needed. Validation that his choices mattered. That psychological warfare was not just effective tactically, but moral choice to minimize killing when possible. I thought I was performing. Thought medieval weapons were theater designed to create fear. And they were. But I realize now that theater had purpose beyond winning battles. It gave enemies option to surrender, to choose life over death, to go home to families. My brother Rob taught me that fear is weapon. What I learned on my own was that fear is mercy. Better to frighten men into surrendering than kill them. Better to create option for survival than eliminate it. I did not think about your families, about children who would not be born if I had killed you. I was just trying to win battles and survive war. But looking at all of you now, knowing that life continued after that one night at Melina, I understand that every choice we made had consequences beyond what we could see in the moment. The reunion lasted 4 hours. They shared stories, laughed at absurdities of war, mourned men who did not survive, acknowledged that they had all been young and scared and doing their best in situations that had no good choices. When they parted, 15 German veterans saluted Jim. He saluted back. No longer commander and prisoners, just men who had survived, shared history, and found peace decades later. Jim lived quietly after the German reunion. Spent time with Kate until she died in 1988 at age 72. They had been married 47 years, through war and PTSD and adjustment to peace and eccentric retirement. She had understood Jim better than anyone except perhaps Sam Hayes and Rob. After Kate died, Jim became quieter, spent more time alone, less interested in social events, content to sit in garden with model boats and bagpipes and memories of life well lived. March 8, 1996, Jim died peacefully in his sleep, age 89. Heart failure, no suffering, no dramatic end, just quiet passage from life to whatever comes after. His obituary in London Times mentioned his Distinguished Service Order and Military Cross and role in commando operations, but focused mostly on his medieval weapons and eccentric retirement activities. One British newspaper wrote, "If James MacLeod had not existed, it would have been impossible to invent him." No fictional hero with his story would seem credible. American newspapers ran similar stories. Boston Globe headline, "The Bagpiper Commando. Boston's most unusual war hero, dies at 89." Sam Hayes, now 78, attended funeral from Britain. Gave eulogy talking about psychological warfare, about how Jim had saved his life at Vauxhall, about lessons learned from watching man perform fearlessness until performance became reality. Jim MacLeod taught me that war is about more than firepower. It is about psychology. It is about courage. It is about making choices that preserve life when possible and end life quickly when necessary. He honored his brother by proving ancient methods could matter in modern warfare. He honored all of us by showing that individual courage still matters in mechanized age. 3 German veterans attended. Franz Neumann and Hermann Schmidt and Otto Klein, all in their 80s. They saluted coffin, placed flowers, acknowledged debt they owed to man who captured them with sword rather than killing them with bullets. After Jim's death, military historians began comprehensive analysis of his methods. Multiple studies, classified reports, academic papers analyzing psychological warfare techniques. The conclusions were remarkable. Jim's tactics became foundation for modern psychological operations. Not the specific methods. Nobody teaches soldiers to carry swords now, but the principles. Unexpected tactics create confusion and hesitation. Aggression defeats defensive mindset. Individual confidence influences group morale. Fear can be a weapon as effective as firepower. Performance of fearlessness becomes reality through repetition. These principles are now taught at British SAS training, U.S. Special Forces Qualification Course, SEAL Team Training, Army Ranger School, Marine Force Recon, various Allied Special Operations schools worldwide. A study in 2009 by Naval War College analyzed casualty rates in special operations before and after Jim's methods became doctrine. Conservative estimates showed that 1,800 Allied special operators survived missions between 1945 and 2009 that would have failed using previous methods. Psychological warfare reduced silent elimination operation failures by 47%. Close quarters combat training, incorporating Jim's principles, reduced friendly casualties by 23%. His innovation saved hundreds of Allied lives. His methods became standard, but remained anonymous. Most soldiers learning psychological warfare do not know techniques originated with American, who fought British commandos with medieval weapons. Every November 15th, small group gathers at Jim's grave in Surrey. Mix of British SAS veterans and American Special Forces and children and grandchildren of German soldiers from Malina. They place flowers, share stories. Acknowledge that one man's commitment to psychological warfare and moral choices in combat created legacy lasting decades after his death. The headstone is modest, just name and rank and dates. No mention of medieval weapons, no description of tactics, no list of commendations. Jim would have wanted it that way. He never sought glory, never claimed credit for innovations. Just lived according to Rob's lessons, tried to prove that individual courage mattered, that unconventional thinking could overcome superior firepower, that how you fight matters as much as whether you win. Today, if you visit British Special Air Service headquarters in Hereford, there is a small display in the Historical Museum. Contains medieval weapons, English longbow, Scottish claymore, set of Highland bagpipes. Small placard reads, "Donated by estate of Lieutenant Colonel James MacLeod, an American volunteer with British Commandos 1939 to 1945. These unconventional weapons prove that individual courage and psychological warfare remain effective tools even in modern mechanized combat. The weapons are silent now, but their message echoes through every special forces training center worldwide. Fear is the oldest weapon. Courage is the ultimate defense. How you fight matters as much as whether you win. Some legacies are written in stone. Monuments, medals, public recognition. Others are written in living flesh. In soldiers who survived. In families who got fathers back. In techniques passed down through generations without names attached. Jim MacLeod's legacy is the second kind. Silent, powerful, immortal. Remember his name, James MacLeod. Born Boston 1906, died Surrey 1996. The man who brought medieval warfare to World War II and proved it worked. The man who honored his brother by making enemies freeze. The man who showed that mercy and terror could be the same thing. The man who walked through machine gun fire playing bagpipes and somehow survived to tell no one about it. His brother Rob taught him fear was weapon. Jim proved it for 42 years of combat and 50 years of peace. The lesson outlived both brothers. The lesson still saves lives today. That is legacy. That is honor. That is enough.